right. God bless you and God keep you. We're grateful to be here for another clergy conversation. And I am so happy today to have one of my favorite preachers, mentors, big brothers, as I call him. He is the proud pastor of the First Baptist Church of North Tulsa. And also he is our state convention of our Baptist convention and our West Region vice president for our National Baptist Convention. So he's a busy man, but he consented to take some time out for us today. So I want to welcome today Pastor Anthony Scott. Pastor Big Bro, thank you so much for spending a little time with me today.
Pastor Brown, thank you so much for having me. Whenever I see Big Bro, I know that's you that's reaching out to me. Let me say this, because of the pandemic, I have certainly celebrated and congratulated you via text, email, but I want to look at you face to face and just say congratulations on entering the pastoral ministry.
Thank you.
So very proud of you, and I know you're going to do a great job, and you're one of the great innovative minds. You have the courage to pastor, and God has very much called and prepared you, and you continue to equip yourself. So I just salute you, and glad that your first pastorate is in the Oklahoma Baptist State Convention. So the Lord got two things right: called you to a church and called you to the greatest convention. State convention.
Absolutely. And I'm grateful to be a part of our state convention. I'm grateful for our relationship. I can say this before we get started. Pastor Scott B. Bro has been so kind to me. He let me preach at First Baptist North Tulsa for a church anniversary. Then we came back a year later for a Good Friday service and a youth and young adult revival. And then when I first moved back to the state, he was kind enough to let me be a part of our young preachers hour. So he's definitely been very instrumental in my life. So this means so much to me that I'm having this opportunity to share these moments with him. So let's get right into it. So talk to us a little bit about your background.
Well, I actually in next year I will have been pastoring for 30 years. And just to go all the way back and speed it up, I was actually, I'm a native actually of St. Louis, Missouri.
Okay.
Was actually born in Fort Wayne, Indiana, but didn't spend a whole lot of time there. But my mother's side of the family, everyone's from St. Louis.
Okay.
Moved to Oklahoma when I was a very small boy. So I've been in Oklahoma most of my life.
Yes, sir.
I'm a son of a preacher. My dad is actually a retired United Methodist pastor.
Okay.
He started off as a Baptist minister, transitioned to United Methodist Church in the late 60s. When I felt the Lord's calling on my life to preach, I received my dad's blessing to go back into the Baptist church. And so I've been pastoring in the Baptist church, the church I love, for 30 years.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. And so when you were growing up watching your father as a pastor, what things did you kind of, take with you? Like what things did you learn? What things did you observe that in a sense were inspirational to you and even helped you now?
Well, I'll say from my father, I learned a great deal about what it means to be a lover of books and a lover of reading.
Yes, sir.
My dad was a lover of books. He was constantly reading, educating himself. As a matter of fact, obviously, my dad is the one that started my pastoral and my ministry library. And it was not just a few books. It was almost half an office of books. So I really received my love for books, my love for learning, and the value of educating oneself as a pastor and a minister from my dad. And then a lot of emphasis on from my dad, the pastoral ministry outside of the pulpit.
Yes, sir.
Administration, right? Counseling, those little nuggets outside of ministry. And then also from my dad being United Methodist pastor, appreciation for clergy who serve in areas of ministry outside of the pastoral ministry, whether it be chaplaincy, which my dad was a chaplain at a hospital full time. So I gained an appreciation for other aspects of ministry. I'll say my father in the Baptist ministry, who's now home with the Lord, Dr. Bertrand Maurice Bailey, Sr.
Yes, sir.
Again, from him, a lover of books, a tremendous mind. He made sure that I understood that a pastor's mind must be sharp, must be constantly and ever learning. He really, I'll say from him, he really helped to increase my love of preaching.
Yes, sir.
He loved preaching. He was one of God's greatest preachers, and so he exposed me to the best preachers in the Baptist church. Not just listening, but he was personal friends with them. There were many times I'd be walking down the hallway of the convention, national convention, with him, and he introduced me to E.V. Hill, Caesar Clark, who would come to St. Andrew, his church,
Yes,
and
sir.
preach. And so I have to thank him for certainly for that, and for just being a lover of preachers, period. So, and then I'll say, once he passed, even though I was already president of the state convention, I really believe it's important that every pastor has a pastor. So I joined Fairview Baptist Church in Oklahoma City. Dr. John A. Reed Jr., who has been a mentor throughout my ministry, officially became my pastor then. So I've had three pastors, throughout my ministry.
Yes, sir. So talk to us about, because we've done this ourselves, just me and you text back and forth about different books. So talk to us about the importance of reading and the importance of building a library. As you say, Pop Bailey, God rest his soul, talked about the preacher has to keep his mind, the pastor has to have a sharp mind. So talk to us about the importance of building that library.
It's important. And then he, over his lifetime of ministry, gave me a number of books. Once he passed, his wife, Sister J.J. Bailey, my mother in the ministry, allowed me to come by and even get some of his special treasures, which is very, very important. But pastor has to build a library, and a very well-rounded
Yes, sir.
library. Obviously, as African American, as Black preachers, we love preaching. And so it's very important to have books on preaching, not just reading sermons,
Right.
but books on sermon prep.
Yes, sir.
Whether you're an expository preacher, a narrative preacher, and it's important, no matter what style of preacher you are, to be able to study and read all different types of materials on sermon prep. Reading sermons is certainly important, but you need to know how to construct a sermon. So books on homiletics is important. Hermeneutics, how books that help you to be able to dig into a passage, get the right understanding, the right interpretation. So hermeneutics is very important. Um, One of the things that we lack, really a lot of times as Black pastors, is books on church history.
Right.
Right.
Yes, sir.
One needs to be able to study. In other words, you don't just jump from the end of the New Testament to 2022. It's important to read the history of the church,
Absolutely.
good and bad. So you
Yeah.
see, that connecting link. Books on certainly theology and doctrine. Certainly commentaries and resources to help one to study. And as you talk about the ministry outside of the pulpit, books on counseling,
Right.
books on church administration, books certainly on leadership, right? Those things are extremely, extremely important. And, books just on ministering to different generations. And it's important for your library to constantly be evolving because times change.
Right.
Books and resources, they always remain valuable, but the pandemic, obviously, as we know, in the last 2.5 years, totally changed the trajectory of ministry, with innovation, with technology. And so it's important to read some of those cutting edge materials that help keep one fresh. You never discard the old, but you want to constantly be learning and keeping yourself fresh, so that you remain relevant in ministry. And I'll share this too. A library, I love to be able to hold the book, right? But there are electronic means by which one can learn as well. And I'll even say this: if the pastor can't afford theological education, whether it be undergraduate, graduate, and then moving on beyond that, technology affords one the opportunity. When I'm sitting at my desk studying, I go to many of the seminaries around the country. You're able to listen to the chapel services, but more
Right.
important than that, you're able to listen to uh, some lectures that,
Yeah.
that they put online for free. There's really no excuse um, for not exposing one's mind to what's out there in pastoral ministry, theological education.
Yes, sir. And I'm glad you said that because I, for me now at this point, ebooks have become so easy because sometimes I may be sitting down, I got my phone, my iPad, I can easily pull a book up and just start swiping and reading. And also, because I listen to a lot of lectures, especially from Reformed Theological Seminary, a great theologian, J. Legon Duncan, who's part of
Yes.
Reformed, terrific mind. And so you're right, you can hear those lectures as well. And I think that's very, very important because some of these seminaries now, they open their apps. So they have apps to where you can download, you can listen to these different, you can basically go to class, as you say. If you can't afford to go, you can go to class and be able to at least learn from that. So when you talk about education, Pastor, I think it's also important that you talk about, how the importance of seminary education and also the importance, as we're talking about African American preachers, the importance of having, those African American seminaries as well in schools to help us and to continue to teach us and train us. So what are those keys as well?
But I was listening and to a podcast by Charlie Dates out of
Yes.
Chicago, and one of the things he was talking about, particularly in the last 2-3 years, we've been dealing with a lot of social justice and a lot of social crisis issues, not simply in society but within the church,
Right.
right? And really trying to get the body of Christ or Western Christianity to appreciate not only the African American preacher for his or her preaching ability, but for our academic contributions to the history of Christianity. And our academic contributions to the history of Christianity have totally been neglected and left out. We tend to be celebrated and only talked about when it comes to our emotion and our passion. But some of the greatest minds and the greatest contributions to theology and doctrine in church history have come from African Americans. In fact, there are many who say that the greatest theologian produced on American soil is Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He's homegrown.
Right.
He's not German. He's not Swedish. He's not European.
Right.
He's homegrown. So I think so. It's important for us as preachers to whether it be Bible college, right? Because we're always talking about affordability. We're talking about access. Whether it be an undergraduate degree that focuses on pastoral ministry, theology, or graduate level work, seminary, right? Or even working on a doctorate, it's very important that we push ourselves to become the best that we can be. And if those formal ways of being trained, getting academic credentials are not there, again, you have books, you have resources available online where one can still, um, uh, it's certainly no substitute for the classroom and earning a degree, but still one can have access to what's out there, what they need to be studying, and what some of the greatest minds are sharing and talking about. So it's very vitally important for us, particularly as Black preachers.
Absolutely. I think education is very important. And the more I do have been in education now, I'm glad that this age I am now compared to 10 years ago, because a lot of times we may look at those who necessarily didn't go to class and say, well, they didn't go to class, so I don't have to go to class. But we don't see that there's a lot of studying that goes in place. And there are many who have said that they wish they would have went to school, even though they weren't able to go to school. So I think school is very, very vital and important. And we're living in a culture now. And I think this is something else that COVID has done. It has revealed to us that you have to know what you're talking about, because people are going to ask you all kind of questions. Everybody has a phone. Everybody can Google, go on Safari. So you definitely have to know what you were talking about.
Yeah, you do. And again, with so many live streaming, so many ministries having to be hybrid now, excuse me, in order to be relevant. Um, it's one thing to be speaking to an in-person audience, but when you have possibly an entire world
Right.
who has access, it's very important that you know what you're saying, right? And what you're saying be as accurate as possible. But then also something else, when we just look at the time element of maybe not always having 50 minutes to share a message, uh, can you get something substantive and concrete in a message to really benefit someone's life in 20, 25 minutes?
Mm. Yeah,
And that's extremely important as well.
and I would listen to some of your sermons where you would be done in about 2025. But you hit it right on. You ain't waste any time. I'm like, man, how does he do that? In
Yeah,
2020?
and pre-pandemic, I was probably 35 to 40 minutes. Sometimes just certain sermons would I move up maybe to 45. But now I'm somewhere, again, 20, 25 minutes. Sometimes it may get up to 35 minutes, but our sermon prep and delivery is much like our worship services now. We realized there were a lot of things that we had in worship, and we learned during the pandemic we didn't need it anymore.
Right.
And what we've learned probably when it comes to our preaching, we are not cutting out the substance. We're just cutting out a lot of the frivolous stuff.
Mm.
Not really giving as long remarks,
Mm-hmm.
right? In other words, we haven't cut back on any of the content of the sermon. We just cut down on some of the extra stuff that was really taking time away, because we've got to read the text, announce our subject, and get into it. So we haven't changed any of that. We're still introducing the message carefully. We're still transitioning. We're still giving the context of a passage, right? We're still developing our points. We're still concluding. We're still celebrating, right? But we're just kind of leaving out. A lot of times we might have 10 or 15 minutes of talk before we actually preach.
Right.
We realize a lot of that has to go, right?
Yes, sir. So before we segue, since you brought it up, how for you personally the transition now from pre-pandemic church to now post-pandemic and virtual church, how was that transition for you personally? Because I know I've had conversations with other pastors who said for some it was a struggle, because you're going from just basically being used and accustomed to the members just being in the building, but now you have to pastor. As I say, now we pastor two churches. You pastor in person, and now you pastor virtual. So for you, how was that, not just from the from just First Baptist, but even looking at it from our state convention, just going from pre-pandemic to now post-pandemic?
Well, it was very easy for me.
Mm-hmm.
Well, certain elements were easy. In other words, getting straight to the point in the message without a lot of preliminary remarks was very easy for me because I was always uncomfortable in giving a lot of remarks. They were thought to be needed, and you did it.
Right.
But not having to do that was really a release for me, just to get to what I'm up there to do, and then sit down. Now, what I really struggled with initially was that hybrid format, in person and virtual. In other words, you want to be able to engage an in-person audience, but also stay engaged with a virtual audience. And so that really takes some time and some training. Um, and even as a pastor, I've been pastoring, as I said, it'll be 30 years next year, but I have to keep learning. I don't know if you connect with him or follow any of his pages, but Timothy Farmer out of Atlanta.
Okay.
He is the technology ministry leader at Cascade United Methodist Church in Atlanta, and then he's the technology director, I think, for Atlanta public schools.
Okay.
But persons like him were doing webinars during the pandemic on, in other words, how to engage in both an in-person, right, and a virtual audience in our preaching, but then also how to continue to build and maintain a church membership in person, but then also building a virtual membership, right? And then even connecting or helping virtual members get acclimated to your church, with the forms and ways to join church and send prayer requests and things like that. So having that dual role,
yes, sir,
was really a learning experience for me. But for me, again, after 30 years, it helped to revive and refresh me. Because when change comes, one or two things are going to happen. You're either going to get excited, right? Embrace it, and try to retrain and learn, or you're going to become stagnant and you're going to die on the vine because you have not, embraced the new things that have come out and taken place.
My. Yes, sir. So then let's go back to ministry. When did you feel the call of God on your life to become to come into the gospel ministry?
What talking about ministry, I'll just say this: my undergraduate education was quite an experience. I matriculated through a number of institutions because I didn't really see the importance and the value of education. I was just glad to be away from home. So I went to Bethany College in Lindsborg, Kansas, a Swedish Lutheran school on football scholarship.
Okay.
The problem was I was there to play football, but I did very little classwork. So I wound up leaving, spent a little time, as much as I hate to admit it, because I'm a diehard OU fan. I spent a couple of semesters at Oklahoma State University.
There you go.
So you got, but I eventually finished. At Langston University with my undergrad. I say all that to say this: when I was a freshman football player at Bethany College, that is when the Lord first began to call me into the ministry. And all joking aside, I said I was not focused on my academics. Rather than studying business statistics and the things I should have been studying, I had a love and a passion as a freshman in college to want to read books on the Apostle Paul. And while that was great, those were not the classes I was taking. Right. So it really was during that time period. And then probably I like everyone else, I ran from that call. And then maybe 2 weeks before graduating from undergraduate school, I just finally surrendered. What I did, I called my dad. My dad never pushed or prodded. He knew something was going on with me over the last 2 or 3 years. And I called him with tears in my eyes and said, Daddy, the Lord has called me to preach. He said, I knew it. But, that's something that the Lord and you have to work out, and you have to stop running. So, and I sincerely believe we've lost this sense of calling,
Yes, sir.
right?
Mm-hmm.
A supernatural experience, like Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Isaiah, where you know definitively, right, that the Lord has called you. Uh,
Yes, sir.
so many are attracted to the ministry, but it's one thing to be attracted; it's quite another thing to be called.
My.
Because you have to be called um, in order to have sustainability and longevity in this ministry. For instance, during the pandemic, and even as you're dealing with church conflict and the sociology of the church, um, uh, a clergy person has to derive their joy from their calling
Yes, sir.
and not from what they experience.
Mm.
Because the experience of ministry will not always be pleasant. And so when you go home at the end of the day after being beat up, right? After having maybe a horrible day at the church, what makes you come back each and every day is that you derive the joy of what you do, not from what you go through or experience, but from the calling that you know is in and on your life.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. That's great advice. So do you remember your first sermon?
I do,
What was it?
and thank God for. I was reading a book on preaching the other day, and the preacher said, sometimes our sermon titles uh, are in need of redemption, along with the body of our sermon, right? So my first sermon um, was entitled "How to Quench the Black Man's Thirst."
Oh my. Wow.
It was coming from John chapter 7, there when Jesus was talking about if anyone basically uh, drinks
Right.
of me, they will never thirst again. So I talked about how to quench the black man's thirst, and that was that subject and that text were probably the most accurate things that I shared in that first sermon. Uh, because after that, I just went on a tangent about black men getting beat up by police and shot,
Oh no.
and so I was just up there, just I had a subject, I had a scripture, and then I just vented.
Right.
Um, and it was my first sermon, and everybody's like, "Amen." But contextually, I was all the way off. So I thank God for His redeeming grace and allowing us to come back and preach another Sunday.
Yes, sir. So, well, yeah, I know we've all had that experience where we just get up there and start venting, getting all out now because we got the mic and everybody got to listen to us for a minute. So, so definitely. So after that first sermon, how were you growing as a preacher? As an associate, were there a lot of preaching opportunities? How were you growing your gift after that first sermon?
Well, I was reading books on how to build sermons that my
Mhm.
dad gave me. My dad probably gave me my first 3 or 4 books on sermon prep, building sermons. I began to invest my time in developing not only my preaching style, but my sermon prep. I started off as a manuscript preacher, typing my sermons up. I don't do that obviously anymore. I evolved into having notes, to eventually evolving to simply having bullet points. And
Okay.
then from time to time, I'll just have everything memorized and just have the Bible. But for the most part, I have scattered thoughts and scattered notes that are written down. But those scattered thoughts and notes come through not only a week of specific preparation for that specific sermon, but as we went back earlier talking about education in the library,
Oh,
it says the Holy Spirit will bring some things to your remembrance. And so when you have a history of study, and not just studying for a Bible study or a sermon, but just studying, period, those things the Holy Spirit will bring to your remembrance. If not in your sermon prep that week, the Holy Spirit will bring it to your remembrance in the moment.
yes, sir.
in the moment when you're preaching. It may not be written down, but those things you've studied, the Holy Spirit will bring those things to you in the moment, and I love that. Yeah, it's the fruit of preparation.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Mhm.
And so, how talk to us about getting called to your first pastoral assignment?
That was very interesting. I was 23 years old when I first started pastoring. I'm 53 now. I've been pastoring 30 years, and that was a very interesting experience. My first two churches, I was bivocational, which was very interesting because having to work, pastor. In fact, my very first church, I was not only pastoring, I cut the grass from time to time, literally. I was doing the Sunday morning bulletin. And what I mean by that is I was typing
Wow.
it up. I was
Wow.
having to run it off on Saturday, fold them on Sunday, and bring them to church. I did everything but pass them out. I just put them on the back
Wow.
pew and then went on to my office. And so uh, that was a very unique experience. But it helps to humble one and helps one to appreciate when they get to the point like I am now, where for the last 23 years I've been pastoring full time, and I am not a lazy full time pastor because I had the experience of having to pastor and work and do things that were outside of what one would think would be the pastoral calling. Like I said, cutting grass. I was riding a bicycle, going around passing out flyers in the neighborhood. You know what I mean?
Yes, sir.
And so those things right there gave me a great appreciation uh, for the role of a pastor. They really did.
So with those experiences, I think you hit on something I think is very true because everybody won't get called to a full-time pastor at their first church. Everybody won't get called to a church where they have like 500, 300, 200, 700 members. And sometimes you do get called to smaller pastors, or sometimes you do get called to places where, as you say, you have to do more than just preach. So what advice would you give to those who are bivocational who have to do just more than just preach?
Yeah. So I was called to Mount Zion Baptist Church in Haskell,
Okay.
which is where Pastor Kennard Johnson is now.
Yep.
There in the early '90s, and that was not long ago. That church at that time still had outdoor restrooms.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, still had outdoor restrooms. They were still baptizing in the lake. When I was there, we were able to build a new building. So that was a very eye-opening learning experience. It was like pastoring on the frontier.
Right.
Um, and so that gave me a great appreciation, a great love, and some experiences that I will certainly always treasure. But the value is in your calling
Yes, sir.
and your commitment to the ministry, not in the size of your congregation, right? Or
Right.
the size of your ministry. Five members are as important to the kingdom of God as 500. And as a steward, not only of the gospel, but as an under shepherd, as a steward of God's flock, watching over them until he returns, you have to be as good of a steward over the five as you are over the 500. And uh, Reverend Dr. Bertrand Bailey used to always say, hey, if you're faithful over a few, right? It's not just when you get the glory, the Lord will promote and elevate you to be over more.
Right.
But you got to be faithful with those that you have. And so many, when they get called again, you're right. We bypass churches that could give us very practical pastoral ministry experience because we're looking for that thriving, vibrant ministry, right? As soon as we start uh, feel the call to preach, but one may not be ready to handle that level of ministry, and so you wind up being frustrated, right? I'm not saying that one can't, but it's just good to get that experience before one moves into to a greater ministry.
Yes, sir. Absolutely. So how was it just you're 23, you're just starting. How were those, years of pastoring first at Mount Zion and
It's challenging because, again, when you're 23 years old and you're probably, not probably, you are the pastor of people uh, at that time who could be your grandparents.
right.
You struggle with the way they view you. You're preaching, but to them, you're a child. They don't think you have any experience, any wisdom. And from a certain standpoint, you don't have the life experiences. And so
Right.
you got to know how to pastor in your lane, right? But don't run from the responsibility and the authority of being a pastor, even at 23. That's why Paul told Timothy, "Let no one despise your youth."
Yes, sir.
Right? Although you're young, God has called you, and so you don't purport to know everything or to have more wisdom and experience than those you lead. But God did call you, and God will give you the in the moment wisdom and the experience that you need to lead that particular congregation, and that will garner the respect certainly that you need.
Yes, sir. So then talk to us about your transition from Mount Zion to St. Mark. How was that transition?
Well, obviously, in the Black Baptist Church, we're congregational, so as churches become open, one submits their resume, their information, they go and preach. It was a very unique experience for me because I'll say this: uh, my entire 30 years of pastoring have been within one district association.
That is definitely unique.
Yeah, so 30 years within one district association. So trying to navigate um, showing an interest in a church that is in very close proximity to the church where you are is a very interesting thing. So I know the Lord was always involved in those processes. In fact, when I went to candidate at St. Mark from Mount Zion, it's very interesting. I just simply said, "Hey, I need to be off this Sunday." I didn't tell them where I was going, but I was going to St. Mark to preach. When I got back the next Sunday, I didn't realize it, but St. Mark had a radio ministry and had me on the radio. So the people in Haskell heard me. So that kind of broke the ice on that situation. But they supported me as I moved on. And the same when I went from St. Mark to First Baptist Church in Tulsa. When I became the final candidate here at First Baptist North, and they were bringing me in to preach and we're going to vote after church. It was then that I told the deacons at St. Mark what was taking place, and then I would let them know uh, after that Sunday morning sermon what transpired. But that was to the point where I did need to let them know that it was a very strong possibility.
Right. And how many years did you spend at St. Mark?
St. Mark 10 years, and I've been here at First Baptist North 13 years. And with my first two churches, I spent 3 years at one and 4 at the other.
And so with being at St. Mark, from Mount Zion Mount Zion, then to St. Mark, correct?
Yeah, in my first church,
Mhm.
actually, because of my dad was a United Methodist church.
Okay. Okay. So you
Yeah,
were pastoring four churches.
4 churches. So my first church was a United Methodist church. I started underneath my dad, so I pastored that church, and then I moved to Mount Zion Haskell. Let me explain you this situation. When I went to my dad, having pastored the United Methodist Church, Spencer United Methodist Church in Muskogee for 3 years, told him, "Daddy, I want to go back to the Baptist church. I need your blessing." So my dad took me to Dr. Bertrand Maurice Bailey Sr., all right, and told him what I wanted to do, wanted to know if he would take me in. He said he would. And so my dad immediately told me, he said, "Well, you need to step down from the church you have and come to St. Andrew." Dr. Bailey said, "Son, the best way to get a job is to already have a job." He said, "I don't want you to leave there." He said, "I want you to come over here one Sunday morning I want you to preach. I want you to join St. Andrew and then keep pastoring the church you pastor. And so then I did that. I attended St. Andrew for everything except Sunday morning. And then when Mount Zion became open, I applied, and that's how that took place. So Dr. Bailey, so I was licensed in the United Methodist Church. I started my seminary in United Methodist Church. Dr. Bailey, that Sunday when I came over, licensed me and then sent me back to pastor the church I was pastoring. It's very interesting. And I just began to apply as a Baptist preacher for Baptist churches that became open. So there was never a lag in my pastoral ministry. When I left my first church, which was United Methodist, I gave them a 2-week notice. And then I was right there at Mount Zion Haskell. So there was never any lag time. I moved from first church to second church to third to fourth. Each time there was gave that 2-week notice, started at the next church. And one thing I can say I do appreciate in the 4 churches that I've pastored, not only have they all been within the same geographic area within a 50-mile radius of each other, but I'm welcome back at each one of those churches.
Right.
And so that for me is really something that humbles me and something that I'm really thankful for. I wasn't the best pastor. I wasn't perfect, but I'm welcomed back at each and every one of them. And that means a lot to me.
Well, and I think you just said something that you're welcome back, because as you're pastoring, and then, somebody, and being a candidate, it's important, as you say, to still show respect to the church where you currently serve, to leave well. And
to leave with, yes.
To leave well. And I think that's important as well, because as you said, you are a pastor here, but now you're called here. But it's how you leave, it's how you still treat these people that you are serving currently. And so in those instances with these transitions, from your experience, what would be the experience you would tell somebody on the best way to transition and to, leave on good terms?
Yeah, it is. So, I mean, we all have a process. The Lord will lead you when it's the right time to give notifications that you are a candidate, that you're looking at another church. And then when that time comes, there's a way, just like when you apply for a church, there's a way to exit a church, right? Through formal letter, through standing up as a man and telling the congregation, this is where the Lord is leading you. Having a shepherd's heart, even in the exit, having compassion and being able to minister to broken hearts that you broke, right? That is one of the nuances of shepherding that we don't often think about. How to shepherd on the way out is tremendously important, because it also leaves either a good or bad taste in their spirits for the next pastor, right? So that's extremely important as well.
And so, from St. Mark, 10 years. How were your 10 years at St. Mark?
Well, I living in Tulsa, I was driving down there every day. It was a tremendous 10 years. It really was of ministry. I learned what it meant to be a full-time pastor. Many of the things I had to do at my previous 2 churches when I was bivocational, I didn't have to do because there was a leadership team. I would have maybe a minister or 2 that could help me. So I didn't have to do a lot of those things. And so it wasn't actually until I got to St. Mark that I restarted my theological training and education, because I was full time. So St. Mark afforded me that opportunity to learn how to pastor full time, to continue my education, to really begin attending beyond the district and state work, to be able to start attending our national convention, when I was at St. Mark, and so that really was a valuable component to that 10 years.
Yes, sir. And so then talk to us about your final transition to
Mhm.
First Baptist North Tulsa.
You know, the interesting thing here, my wife and I were married. I'm married to Kelly Robin Scott. We've been married for, we'll be 30 years
Okay.
next year. And we were married here at First Baptist Church, North Tulsa. Her
Wow.
father was a member here. So the interesting full circle of me being married here and then coming back to pastor, very interesting. One of the things that I regret, as she does as well, I became the senior pastor here in December of 2008. My father-in-law passed in 2006. My mother-in-law in 2007. So they never were able to see me pastor
Wow.
um, this church. But I know from heaven, they are proud and they're happy. Now, my parents are members of the church.
Okay.
My mother, my father. My father's battling dementia, so it's very important to me. He's a retired pastor. He's battling dementia, but at this point in his life, he is sitting there listening to me each and every Sunday. And the one thing about having your dad and your mom, it doesn't matter if you flunk or not. It's the best sermon they've ever heard. So
Absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely. And you're pastoring
Now the transition to First Baptist North. I'm pastoring. You're going to say a historic church, the oldest African American congregation in North Tulsa. Uh, the process of candidating for First Baptist Church North Tulsa was very interesting, and what I mean, it was a learning experience.
okay.
I think I had a 9-page application.
Okay.
I had to be able to produce documentation from an undergraduate degree, my master's degree work. I couldn't just say I had it.
You had to produce
I had to
it.
produce it, right? Go through phone interview, 2 or 3 in-person interviews. Then I had to come and just be interviewed by the members at large, just asking me various questions that came to their mind, and then preached that Sunday and was voted in as pastor. And actually, Dr. G. Calvin McCutcheon presided over my being elected
Wow.
to pastor of this church.
So you had a long application, multiple interviews. So when you're dealing with these multiple interviews as a candidate, like what's going through your mind? Like, is there nerve? Is there any nervousness? Is there anxiousness? Like, what's going through your mind when you're going through these interviews? And then also, I mean, you look at this beautiful building, which First Baptist is a beautiful building. You're thinking in your mind, man, I could, this would be awesome, but you're going through all of this to get there. Did that make you nervous did that make you nervous? Like, if I do get here, what's coming?
Yeah, it does, because whenever I think it's good whenever the process to become a pastor is not too easy,
Mhm.
right? Because as you go through that, you really, through that process, have a lot of self discovery as to whether you really want this or not,
Right.
and then what it's going to require of you when you actually get it. Now, one of the things that I would think about back in the early 60s, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke in this church from this pulpit. And so one of the things that I reflected on was like, hmm, there are people here who actually heard him preach in this church as a guest, and quite possibly they could hear something in me that can make me want to be their pastor. That just really that just really struck me. But I felt again, the Lord had called me and prepared me, and if He planted me here, then I would do well, because He placed me here.
Right. And so you've been pastoring there since 2008. But how were the even the early years there? Because they say First Baptist North Tulsa is a historical church. It's the
Mm-hmm.
oldest African American church in Tulsa. It has a strong history. The only African American church to survive the Tulsa race massacre in 1921. So how was that? Coming into a church of this magnitude.
Well, and I think having had three churches before that, right, I was prepared to be patient, to realize, as they say, it takes, your pastor on paper,
Right.
but it takes 3 to 5 years earning trust, respect, proving oneself, being faithful and committed before people actually see you, right, as the
Yes, sir.
pastor. So, because it was not my first pastorate, because I'd pastored three previous churches, I was able to be patient um, through that process, and then learning also for the first time how to pastor a church with a staff,
Hmm.
not just leaders who were serving, but I mean paid staff.
Right.
Um, how to manage a staff and how to work with people full time, not just volunteers. That became a unique and a different experience that I grew into as well.
So from every pastor, it's important that you grow.
It is.
Even in how many pastors, whatever the Lord does, it's important for you to grow so that you take those tools from this church and bring not just what you've learned, but also what you observe from this congregation and how it meshes together. So with those keys, when a pastor gets to a new church, or where he gets called to a new church, he or she gets called to a new church, there are dynamics there. As you say, that they have to trust you, they have to know you. So when it gets to those dynamics, what are the keys to, in a sense, learn them, but not lose you while you're learning them?
Well, it's important as we just kind of tie everything in together when we talk about education, we talk about preparing oneself. One can prepare oneself in a general sense, but then when you get to a local congregation, there becomes contextualized ministry. In other words, you've got the book learning, but then each church has its own context.
Right.
Each church has its own unique personality. Each church has its own unique individuals with their own unique skill sets, right? And so what you may have done at one church won't work at another.
Right.
From the standpoint that the church has a different personality, and then the human capital is different. And so you've got to be able to contextually build your vision, uh, while also working within the personality and the gifts and talents that are unique within that church. Now, that's how it is when you first get there. If you have some longevity at a church, obviously people, you have those members and leaders uh, that are already there, but then you have those who migrate into the church, right? After you've been there for a while, who bring a different skill set. And as they come in, it may provide an opportunity for you to somewhat transition just the context of how you do ministry, just because of the influx of new minds, new ways of thinking, right? And so you've got to be patient even in that area as well. It's just kind of like if you get called to coach um, a football team and they've got a good offensive line and good running backs, but no receivers, you don't need to be trying to throw the ball. You just need to keep running. But right, but eventually the Lord sends you some good receivers, right? Then maybe you can expand and start running a different type of offense. So you got to work with what you have and know what you have by getting to know and learn people. Many times people can fail because they're trying to come in and do something that you don't have the gifts and talents to actually
Right.
do.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. And so also, like I said, Big Bro, he is the president of our state convention.
Mhm.
as well. And so talk to us about, being the president of our state convention, just that process and, just for you, what does that mean to you? Not just pastoring a great church, but now you're also the president of a great convention.
Starting to pastor in my early 20s, again, I go back to Dr. Bertrand Maurice Bailey Sr., who helped to create in me not only a love for the local church, but a love for denominational work.
Yes, sir.
District Association, the state convention, national work. He gave me that love and passion. So him, and then also uh, Dr. John A. Reed Sr., who's gone on to be with the Lord, Dr. John A. Reed Jr., men like Dr. Eglin Woodbury, Dr. Tiasha Chappelle Jr. When I was in my 20s, the Lord allowed me to be a young man who was around these men. And as a young man in my 20s, I thought it was important to be around these seasoned men.
Right.
I didn't just run with my peers. I was a fly on the wall listening to these men,
Right.
driving them, right? Dr. G. Calvin McCutcheon, I drove him. Being around them helped to prepare me to one day become a moderator, president of the state convention, and just have an appreciation for the Baptist work and how to lead the Baptist work by being around these great men. So I'm now in my second and last term as president of our state convention. Um, and for the last 3 years, little over 2 years, vice president of the Western region of our national convention, where I get to work with Dr. Jerry Young. But again, from a young man, I had been reading about the history of our national work, being exposed to our national work when I couldn't afford it, having senior pastors help pay my way to go to the National Baptist Convention. And so I just appreciate all of those who made an investment in my ministry and my life, because I wouldn't be who I am or where I am without them.
Right. And I want to hit on a couple more things and we'll be ready to wrap up. But it's important to have that relationship between the young preacher, pastor, and then young pastor, seasoned pastor. I'm grateful for my pastor as well, Pastor E.W. Bryant. But it's important to have those relationships as you were talking about, and not just those relationships, and then watching great men, because Oklahoma has had a rich tradition of great preachers, great pastors. I mean, some of the names you listed off: T. Oscar Chappelle, G. Cal McCutcheon, Eglin Woodbury, who was my childhood pastor and whom I dearly miss. And then J. Reed Sr. I mean, Pop Bailey, who was another legend. Pop Reed, who's still a legend. We got Pop Jemison. We have so many great men. Just those. It's important that you have not just those you can look up to and glean from. Of course, you're a pastor, but also these other pioneers to glean from as well.
And I'm glad you brought that up, because I do have to mention Dr. Major Jemison. Although he's in the Progressive National Baptist Convention, PNBC, he's Oklahoma's pastor in Oklahoma City, was president, their national president.
Yep.
And so once I became state president, and even when I moved up to the vice presidential level, being able to pick his mind uh, on not only how to serve in those positions, but from him even how to carry oneself.
Mm,
Dr. Jemison carries himself in a very presidential way.
absolutely.
To just watch him
Absolutely.
before he even opens his mouth, he carries himself. So watching him, Dr. John A. Reed Jr., the how tos,
Right.
right, of how to lead. Doctor, one of the things that I really struggled with when it came to denominational work, and we know that it's required, it take money.
Yeah.
And Dr. John A. Reed Jr. helped me to stop being bashful about asking black folk for money. It take more than teamwork to make the dream work.
Right.
Uh, it take finances to make the dream work too.
Take some
so
coins. Take some
so
coins.
those contributions from great men, everyone has something to offer, and you've got to glean from all of them.
And so, how is also talk to us about preaching? I know you've had some great preaching pioneers that you've looked up to. You can name those, but also just talk about what do you see in preaching now? Like, what encourages you? What discourages you? What are improvements that can be made in preaching? Talk to us about that.
I'll say whenever I do any lecture or teaching on sermon prep, homiletics, there's a quote from a book called Wisdom of the Ages. It's a book with a lot of seasoned black preachers and pastors who gave little tidbits of advice to younger preachers and pastors. And in that book, the late Sandy Ray
Yes, sir.
gave some advice to then a young Otis Moss Jr.
Hmm.
And Sandy Ray told Otis Moss Jr. that every preacher needs to have a gallery and a garden.
Hmm.
You need to have a gallery where you can reach up and commune with some of the greatest minds of the past, prophets, the apostles, those in church history, even some of the philosophers like Aristotle, Socrates, Langston Hughes, some of those who made contributions to our history. You need to have a gallery where you can reach up and commune with great minds of the past. But Sandy Ray also told Otis Moss Jr., you also got to have a garden where you grow your own plant,
Wow.
right? So you got to have a gallery, but you can't just live on what everybody else thinks. You got to have a garden. And Sandy Ray said, whenever you are able to balance that gallery and the garden, you'll be like the Apostle Paul and say, I know in whom I believe.
Yes, sir.
I'm not just reaching up and communing and taking somebody else's stuff. I've grown my own that I know is in line with what they said.
Yeah.
And I know in whom I believe. So I would say that is something that's extremely important.
Wow, that's very important.
And as you're communing and growing your own, it transitioned. My preaching style and sermon prep has changed during the pandemic.
Yes, sir.
You realize that you're constantly growing, right? And even changing your way of delivery because we're in a different format, right?
Right.
And so there's growth that has to take place there too. So you've got to be on the cutting edge of new resources when it comes to preaching. So you want to read um, certainly historically, and he just passed the books that Henry Mitchell wrote, right?
Love Henry Mitchell.
Yeah, and then you want to keep going and read on what not Cleophas LaRue
Yes,
was
sir.
writing. But then you got some younger preachers like Philip Pointer and others,
Yeah.
Charlie Dates. There's a book called Say It, where these
Great
young
book.
preachers, great book,
Great book.
where you got some young black preachers, academically trained minds who were giving really a fresh approach to preaching in this new age. So there just has to be a combination of them all.
And so, as we get ready to wrap up, it's just that power of preaching. Like we talk about, and I know with your last address, you even shared that with us, is that we do these, we can do this, we can do that. But at the end of the day, preaching and teaching is still what really matters.
It is Paul, Romans 1:16. Paul said, I am not ashamed of the gospel of Jesus Christ because it and it alone has the power to save. And so we, like the song says, 'tis so sweet to trust in Jesus. We have to rest and trust in his promise and say what thus saith the Lord. Because no matter how times change, whether we're pre-pandemic, post-pandemic, or another pandemic, people are still coming to the house of God wanting to know, is there a word from the Lord?
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Yes, sir. And so, Big Bro, is there anything else that's on your heart? Anything else you want to share before we close?
So I think formats and venues. I just think you, as a young pastor, as an innovator, having the courage to have conversations like this. Again, iron sharpens iron, and it helps us to really revision, recast where we are in ministry, uh, have some reflective moments, but then also have some prospective hope. And I think that is why this is important. And God, again, Romans 8 and 28, this pandemic, a lot of these conversations, right, we were having amongst ourselves at Golden Corral.
Right.
But now these conversations are being had so that a wider audience can hear. Black preachers have been sitting down having these discussions one on one at lunch ever
Right.
since.
Right.
A lot of people may think we just sitting down there eating and joking and having fun, and we might be talking about sports, but at some point in that conversation, we're going to start talking about preaching, start preaching to one another, start
Absolutely.
talking about ministry. And now these conversations are available to a wider audience. And I think God has done Romans 8 and 28 when it comes to this pandemic. He's worked it out for our good.
Yes, sir. And also, tell them about First Baptist Church. Tell them about the church in case that anybody's ever in Tulsa. Give them information about.
We're at 1414 North Greenwood Avenue. We have our Sunday morning worship at 10 a.m. on Sunday morning, virtual and in person. You go to our church Facebook page, First Baptist Church North Tulsa. Catch us. If you're in close proximity, we welcome you to come and worship with us at 10 a.m. Our Bible studies are still virtual on Wednesday nights, 6 p.m. Central. So invite you to go certainly to our platforms to check us out there as well. So the ministry is going and going well. And so we just thank God for what he's done and how he's provided for us.
Yes, sir. Well, that's a wrap. We thank God for another clergy conversation. I'm gonna ask Big Bro to stay on after we get ready to end this, but please like, share, and comment this conversation. And once again, if you're ever in Tulsa, you can go to First Baptist Church North Tulsa to hear our president, because he is one of God's best preachers and best pastors, and so you will not be disappointed going to First Baptist North Tulsa. So God bless you and God keep you. We thank you and we look forward to seeing you next time.
All right, thank you.